Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Friday Night Drive Western Suburbs podcast. I'm Josh Welge here with Jo Boenitz, taping this on Monday afternoon, a little bit early this week. Obviously, a different schedule of Thanksgiving, but a lot of football to talk about. Joel, how you doing today?
I'm doing good. I'm still trying to recover from some pretty crazy games last week, so I'm excited to talk about them.
Certainly a lot of crazy games, a lot of crazy finishes. You were there for one of them that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But, Joel, I want to start with that Class 8A semifinal, York, Neighborville Central, and really one of the craziest finishes I've ever seen. Just talking to a colleague of ours, John Sally, he's never seen it before either. I don't know if you saw it. The game was on the U, so credit to those guys for having that game on TV. But to set the stage, York was leading the game 20-13. Just a few seconds left, and they had a 4th and 1 at their 43-yard line. And instead of going for the punt and risking everything associated with the punt, York snaps the ball to their quarterback, Bruno Massel. He's a state caliber sprinter, as you know, and he just ran backwards. He ran backwards 43 yards all the way to the end zone. And fortunately, there's 10 seconds left, and time expired right before he was tackled, or right as he was being tackled, actually. And that was the end of the game. And the final score was 20-15. Again, Joel, I have never seen that play before. I was talking to a few, just kind of hearing from different people. There was some people that said that was brilliant, amazing, the best thing they've ever seen. There was other people who were like, what was he doing? What if he fumbled? They could have scored. But, man, what a wild finish. And it sends York to state football championship for the first time in school history.
Yeah, I mean, credit to that, or credit to Bruno Massel there. I mean, obviously taking a giant hit in the stats department with that rush back. But I mean, credit to him for, being smart enough to, have that play happen, because obviously there's still time left on the clock. Anything can happen, especially in a state semifinal game. There could be a chance of, a Hail Mary, a block punt, stuff like that. So, to be able to run out those final 10 seconds of the clock. And I mean, I was looking at the play, because I did end up seeing the replay of it, and there was a good chance that he could have actually been tackled in the end zone with like 3 seconds left. They had a couple of Naperville Central guys who were right on him as he made it back there, but he made sure to stay elusive, stayed up on his feet, and as soon as the clock had 0, step out of bounds. Very smart play there, and what a way to get to the state title game for the first time in school history.
I know, it's funny when I was watching it live. It's one of those things where it's like a horror movie where they're running away from the bad guys, and are they going to be able to make it and be able to make it in time and get out alive? And obviously they did. But man, Bruno Massel, he's a kid that I've had a chance to see him live a few times this year. Obviously got to see him on TV. Kid just makes plays running the football and passing the football. You mentioned took a stats hit. He had about 300 yards of offense before that, for that last play. And that last play was a pretty good minus 43 for him. But he had a big 50-yard run earlier in the game that set up York's first touchdown. And then a really big play late in the game. They were leading by, I believe they were leading, they were leading at the time by one. I believe it was 14-13. They had I believe it was a fourth and long or 3rd and long. He made a play. He threw off 1 foot, off balance, under pressure, just a dime, 30 yards in the air to Simon Kadowski. It set up a touchdown for Jimmy Connors. And again, sends York to state. And again, Bruno Massel, I mean, like we said before, he's a state caliber sprinter, great running quarterback, but he can make plays through the air too. And he showed it, and he sends York to state. And man, what a story for that York program. I mean, they tweeted it out Saturday night. When those freshmen, when they first started at York High School, York had not been to the playoffs in 10 years. Their last game is going to be in a Class 8A state championship game. Pretty good stuff.
Yeah, it's really been a great turnaround for York. I mean, obviously, there's 2 losses earlier in the season to Downersfield North and Lions. We were kind of like, kind of questioning, how they would be able to perform in the playoffs, and they have just emerged as one of the top offenses, defenses for that matter, throughout the entire playoffs, and they showed it once again against a tough Naperville Central team. So huge credit to York on that, on making it to the state title game.
Yeah, fun finish there, and fun finish at Lincoln Way Central, the game that you were at. And man, that was a game that it seemed like, found on Twitter, there's a few times like I was thinking, okay, well, that's probably the game right there. Including when Lincoln Way Central scored late in the game. But again, Michael Vander Leeuwen-Guerin, the sophomore, and Isaiah Brown, the receiver. Wow, what a game and what a finish for those two.
Yeah, I mean, it was so funny because, I mean, throughout the first half, it was a relatively close contest, but Lincoln Way Central, got the lead kind of early and they stuck with it. And third quarter, there was nothing that happened. And as soon as nothing happened in the third quarter, I'm like, oh, this fourth quarter is going to be fun. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, it was basically like a pendulum for that entire fourth quarter, for the final like half of that fourth quarter. I mean, Batavia got the lead. I believe it was 18-14 at the time with 5 minutes left. Then Lincoln Way Central got the lead once again, made it 21-18. And then Michael Vander Leeuwen-Guerin, helped Batavia 82 yards down the field. And with 30 seconds left, found Isaiah Brown in the end zone for the go-ahead touchdown, giving him the 25-21 victory. But man, what a game it was for both sides. I mean, especially considering how rush dependent both of these teams had been heading into it, it was more of a, contest of who had the better air game. I mean, Drew Woodburn, who's, usually been the one heading it off, he ended up having 180 yards through the air for Lincoln Way Central. And a good majority of it was finding junior wide receiver Drew Andreessen the entire time. I believe he had 150 reception yards in that game. But it seemed like every single play, he had a Batavia defender just kind of draped on him, but he still managed to get a catch. And it was crazy to see that on that side, but it was even crazier to see, Batavia having success through the air once again. I mean, it was just a crazy game. I could go on about it forever.
Yeah, well, the passing game is something that at the beginning of the year with Batavia, it was a reason that gave me pause if they were able to have the team that can make a run like this. Because, I remember I covered the first game of the year against Glenbard West, a game that, Nathan Whitwell had 35 carries in, which was a great game for him. But you're kind of wondering, is that really going to be sustainable in these deep playoff runs? Because eventually they're going to need to make plays through the air. And I just wondered if eventually they were going to have a team capable of that. But they found it late in the year with the sophomore Michael Vander Leeuwen-Guerin coming up and rotating with Bodie Anderson and Michael Vander Leeuwen-Guerin. I mean, he is he is not he's become a legend in the wrong way for the Lincoln Way School District, because 2 weeks ago he did it Lincoln Way West, and this week he does the Lincoln Way Central with the late comebacks. Yeah,
I asked him about that. Like, this is your second week in a row where you've led, a game-winning drive against the Lincoln Way School. I mean, what's going to happen with that? And he just told me, he was like, I just remembered looking at Bodie Anderson on the sideline and just being like, man, this is fun. I like when this happens. So
yeah, the ignorance of youth. He doesn't know any better. He's like, this is just fun. This is just fun. Yeah, it's fun. It's the semifinals, game on the line. But great job by him. Great job for Batavia. They're going back to state with a throwing win. So, hats off to them. They're going to be joined by another Duquesne Conference team. One of the big wins, and if you want to call it a surprise, you can. Them knocking off Cary Grove 28-26. And boy, last week I read a story that Boone Thorgerson talked about playing complementary football. It's something they've talked about all year. And darn it, they didn't do that last week, because, Tony Chahino continued his monster year. He threw for 388 yards. He's now thrown for, I believe, 46 touchdowns on the year. Talon Taylor, I think he had 11 catches and a couple touchdowns. But they did things. Everybody got in on it. They had a huge 2-point conversion stop late in the game that was able to keep their 2-point lead. And then they recovered another onside kick. How many onside kicks are they going to recover? And I think that's the fourth one in the last 2 weeks.
3 weeks. I mean, yeah, but no, it was just an amazing game, and pretty much a lot of things went right for Geneva to have that happen. You mentioned the 2-point conversion that they stopped, that led to them stopping the tie. But I think the even bigger play was near the end of the first half. I believe, was it the first half? I think it was in the first half. Geneva's offense actually stopped Cary Grove from reaching the end zone in a goal line stand. I mean, there were 3 consecutive plays that were within Geneva's 5-yard line, and they kept them out of the end zone there. They kept the triple option out of the end zone, and it was just, it was a very impressive stop, and the defense showed up when they needed to. And I mean, you mentioned it, Tony Chihino, did super well in the game once again, 388 passing yards. Talon Taylor, once again, I believe he had 195 reception yards, and he even had two one-hit catches in the game. One of them, on the sideline, he just basically reached out and grabbed it out of the air. It was probably one of the most impressive catches I've ever seen. But yeah, no, a lot of things went right for Geneva in that game in order to reach the state final for the first time since 2008. I mean, a lot of the players that are on this team weren't even past 3 years old at this point. So a really impressive win for Geneva against a really talented Cary Grove team.
Yeah, I think Tony Chihino was 3 years old because Alex Kentecki, our writer, in his lead of the story, he talked about that. Tony Chihino says he was there and from that 2008 game, and he's got the pictures to prove it from when he was 3 years old or whatever at the time, and obviously a big one leading them back. But you mentioned Talon Taylor. These teams played last year in the playoffs. Cary Grove beat them rather handily. I think it was 41-7. Talon Taylor did play in that game, but he was coming back from that injury that he'd suffered, the leg injury he suffered against Pavia. I don't think he was 100% for that game, but he still played. And, he talked about in the story that game really, kind of really has sat with him for obviously a year. And obviously he comes out and he plays the way that he's capable of. One of the best players in the state. Huge game for him. Another one, too, that I noticed, we talked about Michael Vander Leeuwen-Garren for Batavia coming up. I don't know if you noticed, there was a sophomore for Geneva, Nelson Wendell, a late season call-up from the JV team. He had a sack, he had a fumble recovery, and he had a sack, an interception, and he also recovered the onside kick. So interesting that for both Batavia and Geneva, really big-time plays for guys that were not on the varsity team for a good part of the year.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy to think that it's like for some of these kids, they were playing in the Batavia-Geneva game, but they were playing in the sophomore game beforehand. Yeah. And now they're making big plays for both of these teams. But yeah, no, it was a really impressive showing. And actually a funny story, I did end up seeing this on a live stream. For the onside kick, it wasn't Jaden Hodgson who actually kicked the ball. It was sophomore Bennett Conkey who kicked the ball, and Nelson Wendell came up and, secured the onside kick after it bounced off of a Cary Grove defender. But, I mean, huge game for the sophomores overall for the Duquesne Conference.
Bennett Conkey do any of their kicking?
I believe it was just for that onside kick. I know he did kick an extra point earlier in the year after, I believe it was one of those games where they were calling off players a whole lot for, the shin guards or like the knee pads being in the wrong position. They did that with their kicker at one point. They're like, what do we do? Send Bennett Conkey in, and he kicked the field or the extra point. So he has done kicking for them before, but I don't think for an onside kick.
Great deal. Great excitement for Geneva. It's going to be fun next Saturday with Geneva and Batavia playing at back-to-back games that we'll talk about, a little bit later in the podcast. But game that I was at on Saturday, Nazareth playing St. Francis, a rematch of a Week 9 St. Francis win, also a rematch of last year's semifinal that Nazareth won. And Nazareth, I mean, I was talking to another writer before the game, and I said, at St. Francis, they've had a great season. They have beat Naz in Week 9, but Nazareth has 6 seniors that played for the state championship team 2 years ago as sophomores, as starters. And they also have their quarterback, Logan Malachek, and their best defensive player, Gabe Kaminsky. They started as freshmen for a quarterfinal team. Long story short, I was saying, not to take anything away from Nazareth or St. Francis, I just don't see Nazareth losing their last home playoff game, with that kind of experience. And sure enough, that experience really bore itself out. Nazareth was able to jump out to a quick 14-0 lead. Logan Malachek hit a couple, deep strikes to get off to a really good lead, and it really kind of set the tone for the game. And Nazareth's defense, it gave up 39 points to St. Francis. They got hit for over 50 points against Mount Carmel. Their defense was really good. they just made things very uncomfortable for St. Francis. St. Francis was really never able to get in sync in that game. Brady Palmer just kind of struggled. They tried a couple of trick plays where they did like a reverse throwback deep pass, and Nazareth was all over it. They were ready. They were disciplined. They were able to get an incomplete pass the first time, and then they were able to get it again on a 4th and goal at the end of the first half. And then, the other big part of the game is St. Francis actually opened the second half with a kickoff return for a touchdown for Zach Washington. But then Nazareth comes right back with their own kickoff return for a touchdown. That's another thing that I've never seen before, is back-to-back kickoff returns. Edward McLean for Nazareth gets it. But, Nazareth never looked back, and now they're going back to state for the 3rd year in a row. And on the other side, going to be honest, St. Francis was pretty disappointed, not only in that they lost, but in how they played. I think they felt that they were a better team than they showed. The final score was 40-21, and Nazareth really controlled that game. And I think that loss really did not sit well with the St. Francis side, just the way they came out and played.
Yeah, we talked about it in the podcast last week. We talked about how each of the last 3 contests were really close between these two programs, and how we expected it to be close again. And for Nazareth to come out and basically just dominate the game throughout, obviously it is a tough loss for St. Francis as they fall in the semifinals to Nazareth again. But it was just a dominant showing from Nazareth all throughout, and they're looking pretty keen to winning another state title.
No doubt. They lost to week 9 to St. Francis, but ever since the playoffs have started, they've rolled through their first 4 opponents. They've been very impressive, and they look like a team that wants to win a 3rd straight state championship. So we'll see what happens with that. Last semifinal I touched on last week, Montini with a really good win over Wilmington. Final score was 42-12. If Montini is going to score 40 points in a game, any team's going to be tough to beat, but especially with that defense. That defense basically has everybody back from last year's semifinalists, but their offense, we've talked about it before in the podcast. The offense has really kind of turned a corner since about week 4 or so. They went full time with a sophomore, Israel Abrams, full-time quarterback as a sophomore. He was rotating early in the year, but he had a big game. He threw for 4 touchdown passes. Santino Florio was 1. CJ Harkins had 2 others. And then Jeremiah Peterson, he's a kid he was Montini's middle linebacker last year, and they've had some injuries at running back. He's taken over, and he ran for 140 yards, and just kind of a dominant win for Montini. And first time going back to state since 2018. I'm not surprised that they won. And again, if they're going to score that kind of points, it's going to be pretty difficult to beat that team because that defense does not give up many points.
Yeah, I'm sure Montini was kind of happy to have another big, scoring game after these past 2 weeks where they've kind of, had to grind out victories in each of the last 2 rounds. But yeah, no, it was definitely a dominant showing from Israel Abrams in that game. And, they've shown consistently how good of a team that they can be throughout these playoffs. And, they did it once again in the semifinals, and they should definitely be a fun one to watch next week.
Yeah, so I guess we'll kind of segue right that into the championship weekend that we have ahead of us. We have local teams in 5 of the 8 state championship games, and I'll start with the Montini game. They're playing Monticello in the Class 3 state championship at 4:00 on Friday, and Montini I mentioned before. There was about a decade where they were basically like regulars. Every year they were at state. It seemed like I think they were there like 8 or 9 times out of 10 years, something crazy like that. But they have not been back since 2018. But man, I tell you what, everybody was saying that game against Byron was sort of like the sort of unofficial state championship game. And until I'm told otherwise, I think it might be. Monticello is a really good story. I think they were a state champion in 2018. I did a little research. Ike Young, he's a dual threat quarterback. I think he's thrown for 3,000 yards. He's rushed for 1,000. I believe he's going to Illinois as a baseball commit. So he's kind of the player to watch for Monticello. But again, Montini, coming from that Catholic league, the schedule that they play in week and week out, then they were able to handle Byron. It's very hard for me to see Montini losing this game on Friday. The one wild card I will say is with the sophomore quarterback, you wonder how he's going to handle it, the big stage, a situation like that. Israel Abrams, who's a really good player, he's a little jittery at times in that Byron game, a little sort of overthrows. He threw an interception early. So, I think if he can settle down, play his game, rely on that defense and that running game, I think Montini is a very big favorite in that game.
Yeah, definitely. And you kind of mentioned, having the jitters. Obviously, playing on that big of a stage as a sophomore can sometimes be a little bit, anxiety inducing. And it'll be interesting to see if he can live up to the challenge. But I mean, like you mentioned, Montini is really battle tested throughout the entire season. I mean, going through the CCL, ESCC. I mean, Steve Susie talked about it in his kind of recap, talking about, how some of these teams some of those private schools have been tested throughout the majority of the season. And Montini is definitely one of those teams that has, faced those challenges throughout the year. So it should be really fun to see, if they can live up to those expectations in the championship round.
Yeah, there was 8 CCL ESCC teams that were playing in semifinals last weekend, and 6 out of the 8 advanced. And the only 2 that did not advance, they lost to other CCL ESCC teams. So, quite a weekend for that league, setting the stage for quite a final weekend for that league as it continues to show itself to be the, preeminent league in the state. So that kind of leads us into the Saturday games. And interesting, Joel, I mean, it's kind of a, kind of unofficial theme is rematch day in 3 of the 4 games. The teams are very familiar with each other. I'll start with that 5A game. Nazareth playing Joliet Catholic. Nazareth beat Joliet Catholic last year. The final score was 38-20, but it really wasn't indicative of the kind of game it was because Joliet Catholic actually led at halftime of that game. And then Nazareth really kind of dominated the second half. They actually played earlier in the year as well. Nazareth beat them in a kind of surprisingly low scoring game, 16-13. So, Joliet Catholic is rolling. They won pretty big over Morris last week. They got a huge offensive line that they run behind. But the one question I have is can they contain Nazareth's skill position, their speed on the outside? When they played in that game last year in the 5A championship, they just could not handle them. Nazareth was just hitting him with big play after big play. James Penley, their senior receiver, he was a junior last year. He had a huge game in the championship game. Logan Malachik did as well. And so if Joliet Catholic can kind of, contain that speed on the outside and limit the big play, then this could be a really good game, interesting, close game down to the wire. I just question whether they can do that. I think it's a tough matchup for Joliet Catholic.
Yeah, it definitely is a tough matchup for them. I mean, obviously, they've had some pretty good wins throughout the season. I mean, grinding out wins against teams like Fenwick or Marist earlier in the season, but I'm not sure how they can contain the offense that has, arisen at Nazareth throughout the playoffs. And, last year you kind of mentioned it, it was close for half. But, I don't know if that will be the case again this year or not. It'll just be a game that we'll have to see to find out.
Yep. That'll be the Saturday 10 a.m. game. The second game on Saturday, the 1 p.m. 6A game, Geneva playing East St. Louis. I will say that East St. Louis is probably happy not to see Cary Grove because Cary Grove has really proven to be their kryptonite at state with a couple state championship losses to Cary Grove. But Geneva, obviously they go into this game as an underdog, as most teams do against East St. Louis. But Geneva's just got something special going on, and I mean, obviously East St. Louis, few teams have the talent that they do, but Geneva will have maybe the best player on the field with Talon Taylor.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, they have been battle tested throughout, these playoffs with the wins against, Fox Valley Conference opponents. I mean, Burlington Central in the second round, and then also, that one against Cary Grove last week. So it'll be really interesting to see how they live up to facing off against arguably one of the top, or arguably the best team in Illinois. But, East St. Louis obviously has, the talent throughout their entire roster, and they can get you in multiple different ways. So I'm really interested to see how Geneva kind of tries to limit them throughout that game. And, if we talked about rematches, this is actually the rematch of the 2008 state title game, which is the last time that Geneva has been in this situation. So, they've been able to kind of, go or they've been able to get wins against opponents that they have lost to in previous seasons this year. I mean, obviously, their win against Batavia back in week 6 and then Cary Grove last week. So, they'll have another chance to get revenge. But, it's going to be interesting to see how these two teams face off.
Yeah, I mean, tough assignment there for Geneva, but then again, they've proven that they can beat teams, and maybe teams didn't think. I mean, I was questioning whether they could beat Batavia because they hadn't done it in over a decade, and I was questioning if they could beat Cary Grove. So, we'll see. It's a tough assignment for them. It's East St. Louis, but that's why they play the game. In 7A. Batavia and Mount Carmel, and I tell you what, these two programs, they know each other pretty well. I mean, they faced each other in the semifinals last year, in the state championship 2 years ago, and in the second round 3 years ago, which was a very good game, kind of a controversial ending. My question for Batavia is, can they slow down Mount Carmel's offense? Because Mount Carmel's offense, especially since Jack Elliott, the Vanderbilt recruit, has gotten a lot healthier. They have just not been slowed down. They just really rolled past St. Rita last week. And when they played Batavia last year in the semifinals, I mean, granted, there's some players from Mount Carmel that were in that game that are not in the game anymore. But, I think they dropped about 64 points or something like that on Batavia. Can Batavia slow that offense down? And that probably involves Batavia's offense being on the field quite a bit with Nathan Whitwell.
Yeah, no, it's definitely going to be a game of, how much time can Batavia's offense have on the field, and how little will Mount Carmel be on the field with their offense. So, that's going to be the game plan of Batavia. That's my guess, at least. But no, it's going to be a really interesting game. I mean, obviously, you mentioned it. Jack Elliott has really been good throughout these playoffs and is really, hasn't been challenged throughout, even though they faced some pretty good teams earlier down the line, especially that St. Charles North game that everybody thought was going to be close and then wasn't, unfortunately. But it was, it's going to be really interesting to see, because another thing also is that Batavia's defensive back room, it's been mentioned a couple of times, they're not really big on, that pass protection, but they're going to be needed a whole lot in that game if they want to be able to contain Mount Carmel. So, it's going to be interesting to watch. Batavia's defense has shown time and time again that they can live up to tests against big offenses. And, they're going to have to face the biggest one in the state title game again.
Yeah, tough game for them. Obviously, they go in like Geneva as the underdog in this game, but I will say that they are familiar with Mount Carmel. I mean, this is the fourth year in a row they play each other, so there's no secrets. They faced Jack Elliott in the game before. They did last year. He had a huge game last year, and he's obviously going to be a top priority for them. So that's 7A game, and then the 8A game. Again, another rematch. York is playing Loyola. Loyola got sort of if you want to call it a surprise, knocking off Lincoln Way East, who was the number 1 ranked team in the state last week. Loyola and York playing each other for the third year in a row. They faced each other in the semifinals the last 2 years. I will say, again, every year is different and the way teams are playing. But York faced Loyola 2 years ago, and it was basically not really much of a contest. It was 30-3. Last year they faced each other. It was 23-14, and they were in the game for a good part of the game. So I think that gives them a little bit more confidence. I think for me, the big thing is just, who controls the line of scrimmage in that game. Loyola is a team that they were against at Lincoln Way East. It was tough to get them on the field or get them off the field with their quarterback Fitzgerald running the football and passing the football. And on the other side, can York continue to roll offensively the way they have been with Bruno Massel and their running backs?
Yeah, no, it's definitely going to be a question of who has the bigger momentum heading into this game. I mean, obviously, York has time and time again proven themselves against some elite defenses. I mean, earlier in the season. You got Edwardsville. You've got also shoot, my bad. Oswego. Yeah, Oswego. I was thinking about it. Sorry, I got an email and I lost my train of thought. But, it's one of those things where, Loyola obviously has a really good defense to go along with their great offense. And it'll be, a question of which offense is going to, be better against, some pretty good defenses. So once again, it should be interesting to see how it plays out. And it should be a close game.
Yeah, I mean, the quarterbacks, they don't look like each other. I mean, Fitzgerald is a big kid. He's going to Iowa. Bruno Massel is not that big of a quarterback, but they're both similar in that, I think running is their first strength. Both of them run the football really well, but both of them can make plays to the air as well. So obviously both offenses start with those two guys, and they're going to, be a big part about what happens in that game. So should be fun. A lot of excitement. Looking forward to it. Joel, we're going to be there all weekend. You'll be there on Saturday. I'll be there late Friday into Saturday. We're going to have previews, features all week. We're going to have full coverage all week. What do you think? I'm looking forward to it. It should be a really fun final weekend.
It should be fun. I'm making my trip back down to normal after being there 2 weeks ago.
Your way down there. Yeah.
I'm ready. I know my way down there. I know my way to the Wallies in between. And, I'm excited to see how this week turns out.
Should be a lot of fun. I'll be back here tomorrow. I'll be back here on Wednesday, taping a podcast look ahead with Steve Susi. Again, our previews and features this week and coverage this week on a Friday night drive. For Joel Boenitz, I'm Josh Welge. Everybody have a great Monday afternoon.